Adam, let me begin with you. A much expected outcome, or did this trade deal take you by surprise?
Well, I think I did expect a deal. I think ultimately I didn't expect Boris Johnson to want to be negotiating with the EU into 2021. So I think, it was still, not entirely guaranteed, but I think ultimately myself and many people did expect a deal. I think it is a good thing ultimately. I think it's still what would be known as a hard Brexit. The UK is leaving the EU single market and the customs union. Deal is not everything, but it certainly provides a lot. It certainly reduces tariffs, which is a huge burden on virtually all goods, which I think is a huge achievement. It means that the kind of friction, the daily friction in terms of managing goods that pass between the border do actually move much more easily. And it also doesn't include financial services, or kind of services in general, but ultimately it does make the EU more likely to grant equivalent status to the UK's financial services, and of course to some extent it provides business certainty because they know what's kind of going to happen in terms of the rules from the 1st of January. But I think overall, we've kind of been comparing it to what would happen if there was a no deal. And really, that's the kind of narrative that Johnson's been pushing because that's what he's sort of used as his primary negotiating tactic. But I think ultimately, what the key comparison with is actually what we have at the moment. And I think actually, if you compare it with that, the only conclusion that can really be reached is that this really represents the most serious deterioration in trading terms that the UK has with its biggest trading partner really in its history. And I think overall, the government is trying to spin a different narrative, of course. But I think overall, this is a very kind of significant change from what we already have. And of course, it's only less than a week until we're meant to implement the deal. A deal doesn't guarantee that there won't be any kind of chaos or things will work perfectly. But I think certainly compared to a no-deal Brexit, it's a huge improvement from that.
How would the United Kingdom look like in a post-Brexit era? What would change?
Well, I think to some extent we know what's kind of going to happen over the next year or so because the new deal that's kind of just been announced today will govern what will happen. Certainly what we know in terms of a change is that businesses and goods will no longer have complete movement back and forth in the same way as they previously did under the EU. And of course, there are a whole load of other areas that EU membership provided to the UK that it will no longer benefit from in terms of Brits being able to move and travel abroad and of course, work abroad. So I think in terms of the short term, I think the deal has provided some extent to what we know. But overall, the UK always goes on about the fact that Brexit was for freedom and for sovereignty and to really allow the UK to do what it wants in terms of setting its policy and objectives. But I think what's unclear at the moment is now that the UK has some of that freedom back in terms of sovereignty and allowing it to strike its own trade deals and has a bit more policy and movement in some areas like regulation, what does it actually do with that freedom? And I think that's one thing that actually still remains very unclear. There are some people in the governing Conservative Party who wants the UK to kind of become a low regulation, low tax kind of European equivalent of Singapore. But ultimately, Boris Johnson hasn't really signalled which way the UK will go. So I think that's very much up for grabs. And to some extent, today feels like the end of a process, and I think it is. But I think what we are going to be seeing over the next kind of decade or so is actually a kind of slow shift in terms of the evolution of the UK's relationship with the EU. And I think if you look at the way that Switzerland perhaps negotiated with the EU and agreed 120 bilateral agreements that really kind of sets its relationship now, I think that's probably where we're heading in terms of the kind of style and the approach that the UK government will take. But I think in terms of what it wants to do in terms of its vision, I think that's still very much up for grabs.
The latest border closures that took place about a few days ago, do you think they have played a significant role or perhaps helped the EU and the UK to reach a deal?
I don't expect that it really made a fundamental change in terms of the UK's intentions of agreeing a deal. I think what it really did was highlight the kind of urgency of the need for a deal because, of course, we saw the borders closed and really that kind of had the ability to kind of threaten supply chains at such an extraordinary moment in the kind of UK's economy. Such a critical moment. So I don't imagine that it did change the UK government's perspective because I think ultimately, probably where the most movement has actually been in the last kind of, 10 days or so rather than the last couple of days. And so I don't expect that actually Boris Johnson would have changed his mind based on this. But I think what you did see was, MPs from Boris Johnson's Conservative Party did increase pressure on him. Some were even saying that the current period should be extended because you don't want Brexit and kind of, corona-induced supply disruption to take place at the same time. Some of those difficulties that are caused by the borders being closed temporarily seem to be kind of settling down now, but they could easily ratchet back up on the 1st of January. And so we could still have this sort of very, very difficult situation where we have both of those issues causing difficulties. The UK government has been trying its best to prepare for those. To some extent, I feel for British businesses and, of course, European businesses, because they've been told to prepare for the new situation. But ultimately, there's only so much that they can prepare for. If there's sort of chaos and disruption at ports, there's really very little that they can do about that.
I do have a foreword in front of me right now. Now, what do you make of it? Who made concessions? Because that's unclear right now. Ursula von der Leyen called the deal fair and balanced, but was it?
Well, I think, one of the most important things over the next sort of few days as both the EU and the UK try to sell the deal to kind of their respective sides in order to get ratification is to understand really their words in the context of that, because I think both sides are really going to try to claim victory in terms of what they achieved. And I think, as you mentioned, we've already seen that to some extent. I think we saw some movement kind of on both sides. I think on fishing, I think even Boris Johnson acknowledged that he kind of made a compromise towards that. Over the next 5.5 years or so, we are going to see EU access reduced by around 25%. And then after that, the access to fisheries will be kind of negotiated on a annual basis. And I think that is quite a pragmatic view, actually, to be honest, because it's very unclear to some extent, what needs will be in 5 years or so in terms of kind of domestic fishing capacity. So I think fishing is a clear example of that. On level playing field, I think, again, there was a kind of bit of both, bit of compromise in both. I think ultimately the EU did maintain its overall commitment to not dividing up the single market and the integrity of the single market. I think, there isn't really much of a kind of formal role in terms of the European Court of Justice in managing any kind of disputes. Instead, those kind of disputes over whether there's kind of divergence or any kind of state aid issues will be managed through a third-party arbitration. And I think that kind of represents a compromise on both sides, to be honest, because it's sort of ensuring that there's some kind of independent monitoring of the situation. And that really kind of allows both sides to kind of claim that overall, each side hasn't really claimed a huge victory over the other side. And of course, I think Boris Johnson will try to align what's in this deal. Of course, we haven't seen everything that's in the deal because it's not really been published yet. But he'll try to align that with what the promises were made in the 2016 referendum, which, to be honest, were very ambiguous anyway. And so actually it's, to some extent, an easier job for him to do so. But we'll have to see as the two sides continue to kind of increase the narrative around the deal to sell it to their sides.
Now, Adam, for our non-European audience, what just happened between the UK and the European Union?
Well, I think it reached the conclusion of what can only be described as a very messy divorce deal. I think the UK has been a part of the EU's institutions for really the best part of kind of 40 or 50 years. And generally, the EU is sort of moving in the direction of greater integration. And after the 2016 referendum, where the UK decided that it wanted to leave the EU, although it wasn't exactly clear what that meant at the time, we started this process really where the UK was actually deciding what that really meant. And that required a huge amount of political turmoil in the UK that resulted in the change of 2 prime ministers. We had Theresa May, who ultimately failed in her objective to kind of conclude the Brexit withdrawal agreement and failed to obviously stay on as Prime Minister. So I think we've really reached the end of a long stage, not only between the EU and the UK, but overall between the UK deciding itself how exactly and what is the nature of the way that it wants to leave the European Union.
Similar question to you. In what ways Brexit is going to change the UK's relationship with non-European countries?
Well, I think to some extent, again, it depends on the kind of policy trajectory that the UK will set itself on. The UK has concluded around 58 other trade agreements with other countries during this period in which it has been allowed to agree free trade deals. But pretty much all of them are what's known as continuity deals, and so they're basically based on existing deals that other countries have with the EU. And this is hailed as a great triumph for Brexit, but ultimately it's a replication of the EU's work. And
right.
To some extent, these are the exact deals that Brexiters were saying were so terrible for the UK, and the UK has suddenly adopted them as their own. So I think we haven't seen yet any kind of major changes in terms of how the UK will approach other countries. I think overall, still the UK will kind of remain aligned to Western sort of causes and Western values. Of course, the UK remains a part of other institutions such as NATO. So I think in terms of major kind of policy misalignment, we probably won't see that. But we could see, as Rebecca mentioned, the UK taking major steps to agree other deals with countries such as the US. Well, that may be more difficult now that Biden is set to be sworn in as president in the next 2 or 3 weeks. But ultimately, it's not only economic institutions and rules that the UK is not part of, but it's in fact political institutions as well. And that means that the UK can kind of set a clearer path in terms of its foreign policy. And so, of course, when the EU puts out a statement on kind of major developments that happen around the world, the UK's name is not attached to that. And the UK is also not a part of the of the EU sanctions regime. And so overall, that allows more bilateral engagement that the UK can do with other countries. But I think, the important thing to realize is that, overall, the UK is a significantly smaller country, both in terms of population and economy. And so just in terms of how much of that kind of formal power it can yield, it's not exactly clear. And I think, what we've seen also in the UK is steps to kind of step back from some of the kind of policy projects that the UK had when it was in the EU. The UK announced that it was disbanding its Department for International Development, which was followed a couple of months ago by actually announcing a reduction in the amount of foreign aid that it has. And so based on that, you would actually indicate a kind of withdrawal in terms of some of the UK's role from the world, which seems to be inconsistent with what are the promises Brexiteers made of a kind of global Britain. And so I think at the moment it's kind of unclear what's going to be seen, but the fact that the UK government will have more bandwidth now that it's no longer spending so much time negotiating with the EU will overall free up a significant amount of time and resources to be able to put into some of those foreign policy projects. So I think it creates a huge amount of opportunity, but again, the UK still has to decide what exactly it wants to do with that kind of newly found freedom.
All right.